Afternoon or good evening, depending on where you're joining from today. Thank you for joining our weekly live podcast discussion. Today's topic is lessons from 100,000 plus ERP implementation case studies. And I'm going to introduce our guest here in just a moment. But before I do, a couple of logistical items. First of all, my name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting, and we're an independent consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world with their digital transformation journeys, including software selection, implementation planning, and actual implementations. This podcast is a live production of our weekly Transformation Ground Control podcast, which you can find at transformationgroundcontrol.com. So by joining our live stream here today, you are actually part of our live podcast production. So thank you for being here today. We take these live conversations, we edit them, we add more content to them, and then we create a full podcast episode. And that podcast is called Transformation Ground Control, which you can find again at transformationgroundcontrol.com. Our guest today is here to discuss lessons from 100,000 case studies related to ERP implementations. And before I get to my questions and the introduction of our guest, I'd like to, first of all, mention to the audience that we encourage any sort of questions you have along the way. Please drop those in the chat. We're monitoring the chats across all the platforms we're streaming to today, including Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, and Twitter. So be sure to drop those in the chat, or I should say X instead of Twitter X, whatever you want to call it now. So we'll take questions there. And speaking of the chat, if you don't mind just dropping in the chat what city and country you're joining from today. My guest and I are on separate continents here today, and I'm sure a lot of the guests here are on separate continents here today too. So I'd love to hear where you're joining from today. What city and country are you in? So thanks again for being here. And our guest here, I'm very excited to have on the show. First time on the show, although we have met before. Last time I was in Amsterdam a few weeks ago, we had a great opportunity to meet and film some live interviews and things of that nature, but we thought it'd be great to have him on the podcast as well. And it's Professor Hans Mulder, based out of University of Antwerp. And I'll let him describe his background in more detail here in a second, but he's a professor, he's a PhD, he's an IT expert in court matters in the Netherlands. And he's also done quite a bit of research. And that's really the premise of today's conversation, is sort of taking all that experience he's got with academics, research, hands-on experience. We want to take all that experience and sort of summarize it the best we can here today to discuss what makes ERP implementation successful and what causes failure. So with all that being said, Professor Mulder, if I could say your name, that'd be ideal. Professor Mulder, thank you for being here today.
Thank you very much, Eric. It's an honor to be here. And it all started many, many years ago, even before I was born. My dad was a pioneer in the IT. He started in the 1960s. And then he chose to collaborate with the Digital Equipment Corporation, DEC, in Boston. And he had the idea that it would be great if software could be reused as package. So he was actually one of the early adopters of the enterprise resource planning software approach. And I learned a lot from him, of course, while working in his company. But also we encountered another law, Eric, the law of Murphy. When it can go wrong, it will go wrong. So that led me and my dad towards the court cases, not as a party, but as an expert witness to testify or to do research, doing expert reports for the courts in the Netherlands about the failed projects. And for me, that was very difficult because what was my experience? It was limited. So I looked for a statistical basis. And once again, I came to Boston because in Boston in 1994, the Stennis Group was founded, and they were the first research company who did statistical analysis on IT projects. And each year they took about 5,000 of those case studies, not questionnaires, real case studies. So they called and they asked the manager, how did the project go? And they asked the finance department, how did it go on budget? And that led to the chaos reports of the Stennis Group. And now, after 25 years, so more than 100,000 case studies, we said, well, now it's okay. We have done enough. So we wrote a book about it, and it was called Chaos Reports Beyond Infinity. And that is what I'd like to talk with you about the experiences of that court cases, my personal experiences as a son of one of the first pioneers in ERP, but also about court cases. So perhaps you can have a discussion about that, Eric, because I know you are in the same league.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And that's really interesting that you have about 30 years of case studies that you've been able to collect and analyze over the years. And I'm just gonna I'm going to actually bring this question from the audience first, just because I think it's something that might be on some people's minds right now. This is from Yaku on YouTube. He says 100,000 plus ERP implementations sounds like it's pushing it. So I think the question that some of us might have is, how did you possibly capture 100,000 case studies? And you sort of just described it here just a moment ago, but maybe tell us a little bit about, you started to describe this, but maybe tell us a little bit more about the research and the data that you collect in these 100,000 case studies. And first of all, how did you get to 100,000? Maybe we could start there and then we could talk about the data.
But that's the reason I started in 1994, because you cannot do it in 1 year. So you have to do it on a, let's say, on a year-by-year basis. So the case reports are bi-yearly. And then we, of course, collect about a 5,000 to 10,000 case studies. So we have a lot of time. So we have 25 years to come to that number. So it is correct that really pushing that. But also, I think we have a group of experts. So it is not done individually. It is a group of experts. And they bring in the case studies themselves. And we also have people to work for us to collect those case studies. And most interesting, I think, is that we didn't focus on the answers. We much more focus on the dialogue. So like we called the general manager and he said, well, how did the project go? Okay, I think it was in budget, it was on time, but you have to call the finance department. So we called the finance department, yeah, it was on budget. And then we called one of the employees and we asked, how did the system run? Well, we don't use it. So for us, it was a kind of idea that what is success? What is success in regard to projects? And then we also had things like, yeah, the project was over budget, 10% more than we expected. However, it was very valuable. Well, is it a successful project or is it a challenge project? So for me, those definitions were much more difficult than we thought from academia. And also it led us to discuss the concept of success, because success now is on time, on budget, on target. But what does that on target mean? It means that you are going to deliver something which you discussed about in the past. Well, if you have a very small project of 3 months, it's fine. But in the Netherlands, we have projects for the government, for instance, who take more than 6, 7, 8 years. And what you get delivered on target is most likely not what you need now. So we changed the definition in the standards group to satisfactory. So you're not going to measure the cost of the project as such, of course, time and budget. But you're going to ask people who are working with project results, how does it work in your company? How does it work for your partners, for your customers? And that means that we shifted from measuring by, let's say, the delivery of the project towards the adoption into the organization. And that is a very much more disturbing fact, that it is not that successful. So delivery on time and budget on target can be done, but really adding value is something which is more important, I think, because that is the reason why you put in $1, you want to have $2 back. But we see that is the opposite sometimes. So yeah, for me, that is how the research was conducted. We didn't only do those case studies. We also, of course, had our expert reports where we were asked by the courts to do the analysis, and that led to all kinds of different perspectives as well. So one of the things I also want to talk to you about is decision latency. Decision latency, sometimes if you have a big project, you want to have more time to make a good decision. But the longer it takes to make the decision, the results are not better. So it is even better to have a fast decision and then reverse it if possible, than having a 2-3 months time waiting for the right answer. So for me, this was very helpful. Standish is a market research company. So that is only one part of my, let's say, affiliation to the university. So next to the market research, which is done globally, I'm also focusing really on things like architecture, enterprise architecture, governance. So for me, it is really needed to have the relevant cycle in place. And there's lots to be done, because I brought, of course, the book with me, the book of the Standish Group, and it's almost a flat line. And the flat line means that we didn't improve that much towards the success of the IT implementations. And at first I was thinking, we didn't make any progress. How is it possible? Because we went from waterfall in the 90s towards agility. So what happened? And there was another law, not the law of Murphy alone, but the law of Moore, who passed away, unfortunately, this year. And he said every 1.5 years we can increase our ambitions. And that is also what happens. So when we were looking at the 90s, we saw ERP being focused internally, most likely in the organization. And when you have a big organization, you were looking at multi-warehousing and those kinds of things. Now, and we're looking at the 20s, it's all about the ecosystem. It is not just the ERP system as a standalone in your organization. It has to connect your entire ecosystem. So we are increasing our possibilities, the law of more. And of course, when you do more, more can go wrong. The law of Murphy.
Right. Yeah, that's very interesting. You hit a lot of really interesting points there. First of all, I think it's super interesting your discussion around how you categorize or how you describe success versus failure. So, for example, you could finish on time and on budget, but not deliver business value. And I think what you're saying is that would probably not be defined as a successful project just because you finished on time on budget. But conversely, if you run moderately over budget or moderately over time, but you deliver a tremendous amount of value to the organization, then you might categorize that as a success, even
Right.
though you might have spent a little bit more time and money than the other example. So I think that's very interesting. The other thing too is, I've always felt this through my career, but you're the first person that I know that has quantified this or based it on fact and research, which is that decision latency. So in other words, that the decision making time, and you think about all these little decisions and some big decisions that have to be made throughout a project. And if you're taking a long time to make these decisions, you're slowing everything down. You're causing the meter keeps running, like your cost keeps going while you're making these decisions. And that you can see how these quickly can get out of control with budget overruns, time overruns, and things of that nature. So I think that's a really interesting point that's worth investigating. What were some of the biggest findings? And you mentioned decision latency is sort of a big finding as far as what could cause success versus failure. But what are some of the other major themes in the research you've seen over the years?
Well, as a lecturer, as a professor, it is very healthy to look at this data because we all learn the students to follow the business case. If you are on the business case, you are the right project leader and doing a good job. But unfortunately, the data shows something different. The data shows if you keep away the farthest from the business case, the highest value can be achieved. And I thought the data is not right. This is not correct because we all learn to stick to the business case. But
Right.
again, here it's on target defined perhaps many years ago. So you should look at business case management. You should look at, can we increase the value during the project by making other choices, other decisions? So for me, that was very healthy to see that the business case was something like, well, you shouldn't do it as a one-time only start for your project. You should use it on a continuous basis and try to increase your value during the project. That was one of the things I was really looked at the data. Another thing is that we had to had a new category because I think 2010, 2012, we didn't have any waterfall project anymore. Nobody was able to present us the waterfall projects. They were all agile. And then, of course, we had agilification. So we called the different organizations and we asked them some simple questions. Do you have stepping stones? Are you delivering continuously? Well, yeah, we have the daily stand-up and we do have the PowerPoint presentations. But at the end, we will do it as a big bang. So we wrote a paper about it, Jim Johnson and I, about the big bang boom. So that is not considered by us as an agile approach because at the end, you are still in the adoption of a huge implementation. So we had agile in name only as a new category we needed to define because it is used on several levels as agility. But really, if you're looking at iterations or you're looking at sprints or you're looking at all those people over documentation things, they were running the different direction. So for me, that was very interesting to see the data. Another thing was that we are focusing on projects actually. So a project has an end and has a beginning, but we also saw a new No, not a new approach, but a different approach, which we first defined as modernization. So you keep your infrastructure, but you have to change some parts of it, and then you rechanging, refactoring your code, and you're going up. And then we said, hey, how is it possible? We don't have any failures. And failures is an interesting definition. Failure is you are not delivering or you are not using it. But if you're doing modernization, you're always using it on a daily basis. So you cannot go on a certain threshold. It is always like you are using it day on day basis.
Mm.
So then we thought, well, that's interesting. So that is actually a non-project approach if you do a modernization. And that was the thing which we are working on now. And to make a distinction between waterfall and agile projects, we talk about flow. It is really still in research, but I think it is interesting because flow means that you have projects of a day. And actually, I said to Jim Johnson, that's interesting. My dad, when he was working in the 1960s, they only had one computer in the company because it was too expensive. And during the day, it did the production. And then they were doing the analysis, and they were asking the users what they wanted to have. And in the evening, they were coding. And if the compilation was okay, then they had new code the next day, and they could learn all the users how to use the new functionality, and then it started over again. So actually, in the 1960s, it was fresh code each day. So I thought, actually, that are projects of a day. And now I think with the new, let's say, capabilities we have, like the systems which are really generated from models, or systems that are generated with the help of AI, or let's say the real sound approaches on software quality. Why can't we go back to the days that we had projects of a day? Because if I lose one day, I only lose one day. But what I see, especially in government, that we lose 6 years, we lose 7 years. And that is, of course, very difficult for people, for their image, for their, let's say, for the reputation. And they don't want to stop that, of course. Well, perhaps there are better ways to create value. So now we are on a, let's say, on a quest to look for projects of a day. And you can also call it flow, because also in other industries, it's happening. And like the automobile industry, this Kaizen, each day continuous improvement. I think that other industries are also in that habit. But of course, there is a catch-22. You cannot have a modernization approach without having the platform. So there will still be a project to have that in place. And that is very hard, especially if you are a huge organization with a huge history and all the data has to be dragged along. That is difficult. And that we can see now. So we're working on that as well to make it a step-by-step approach. And that is what my fellow colleagues, professors, are doing at the University of Antwerp. And they call it evolvable systems. Evolvable systems in such a sense that you can keep up with the changes in the environment, in the functionality, but also in technology. And I think that is needed. We need to really address the problem of technical debt, because that really harnesses all the projects. They are so much, let's say, influenced by the technical debt that they are trying to overcome that by having more meetings. So we also see in the data that the meetings are growing again. So in the past, we tried to delimit that and to having more productivity, more, let's say, productivity in the sense of delivery on a certain frequency. We can now see that some projects, they almost spend all their effort on the meetings themselves. So yeah, there are some interesting stuff to talk about, Eric.
Yeah, it almost sounds like it's trying to find a hybrid or a balance between a big, massive transformation undertaking, but trying to break it down into smaller bite-sized pieces. A lot like the agile mentality, but it's a slightly different take on that approach, it sounds like.
I'm very much in favor for agile, especially when you are looking at the learning capabilities of people and the adoption. But I'm also a fan of waterfall, because as you are looking in the history, you can see that it also was very healthy to have go, no goes. So I'm not against waterfall, I'm not against agility, but I think that we should also embrace the unexpected and the uncertainty.
Right.
So what I see most likely now is that we cannot figure out the next 5 years. What's going to happen in the next 5 years? Well, for my lectures as architect, of course, that is very interesting. Should we have a evolvable architecture or a composable architecture? Or you can see that that mindset also changes to things, how your definition of done looks like, for instance.
Right.
In the chat, I see a very interesting question, Eric. May I?
Yes, there's a few coming here.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
actually, before you pull up that question, if you don't mind, let me just say hello to some people that have dropped in the chat where they're joining from today. You have Johnson from Sydney, Australia. Thank you for being here on YouTube today. Franco from Minneapolis. Thank you for being here. Sanjana from the United Kingdom. Alcinda from Johannesburg, South Africa. Just a few examples of where people are joining from today. And then I have to show this comment just because it's a very friendly comment from Franco on YouTube. Says, hello, dear Eric. I love you. And I love you too, Franco. Thank you for being here today from Minneapolis. It looks like Franco's joining from Minneapolis. So we've got a few questions coming in here. Which is the one you wanted to start with here, Professor?
Well, I like the top 3 reasons for ERP failure or success. I was invited by Dutch Parliament for a committee, just as there was in the UK and also was in the States. And I was the first one to be heard by the committee. And they asked me, can you provide me with a top 3 of success or failure factors? And I said, yes, there are hundreds. There are hundreds of factors. But if I would condense them into 3, it's about people, people, and people. And that was the remark from the Standish Group. So technology is important. But I have seen beautiful ERP systems implemented awful. I have seen ERP systems which were not really suitable were implemented beautifully. So what we can see, if we have a good place, which is that the organization who is going to use the results of the project, if we have a good place, if we have a good team, and you have a good sponsor, those 3, then your chances of success are the highest. And it's not about the personalities, but about the skill. How skilled is your sponsor? How skilled is your team? The opposite is also true. If you have not a skilled team, if you have not a skilled organization, and you don't have a sponsor, well, then your chances are not that good. So for me, that looked at the human side, at the people side of it.
Right.
So because my dad started with ERP in the 1960s, I'm a fan of ERP. But that doesn't mean that they are all implemented on the right way. So next to the, let's say, the technology of the system, technology which is being used, it's also about the approach, how to implement it. And I've seen beautiful things, but I've also seen very strange things. Like, for instance, a US-based company, also with factories in Europe. They were all implemented on a beautiful ERP system, but they were locally implemented. And then somebody said, let's go for a global template approach, that we all have the same approach for the ERP system, and we can have less maintenance costs, we can have faster, swifter adjustments. We only have to look at the localization of that global template towards that factories in Europe and in America.
Yeah, that's
and
interesting.
the same system which was used first on a local basis now became the global, and it became a disaster. So for me, this is not about the system. This is not about, because the system works. So what happened? And then, of course, it has all to do about, do you know the differences between the different factories? Do you know how they are uniformed, how they are standardized? What is the way of communication between the different reporting? And that is, I think, what is most likely one of the biggest cases. It is not the technology part, but the way in which you make your network of commitments, your agreements, the way in which you are using the system. And for me, that was very interesting, because then it was a global project. And now we can see that it's not only within one global organization, but global organizations all around the world are connecting and to different means. So for me, that was the people part. And therefore, I like the question a lot about the 3 reasons. If you have good people, if you have a good sponsor, and you have a good team, your chances are much higher.
Right. So even if you have the best software that could possibly fit your organization, you have the best outside technical implementation partner, even with those 2 pieces in place, if you don't have those internal capabilities and skills that you're talking about, you're saying that you're not going to succeed most likely without having the sponsors that are skilled, the team members that are skilled, et cetera.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
This really something which caught my eye, that sometimes the systems are even better than the old systems implemented. But because of the way people are working, they say, well, the new system has different figures, different numbers, so it should be wrong. It should be
Right.
wrong. But it was more accurate when implemented. So it means that if you don't take into account the skill set of your organization and your team and your sponsor, the technology will only be for a part helpful. Well, one of the professors said you have good systems, you have bad systems, you have good people, and you have, of course, not that good people. And with not that good people, nothing works. And with good people, it really doesn't matter. So it means that technology part is important, but please focus on the skill set. If you can do that, your chances will be even better. And most of the time, when I'm asked to do a opinion for the courts, I go to the specific factory or the office, and you want to talk with people. And that is much more enlightening than looking towards all the business cases and the reports, because you can hear, you can listen, you can see how do you approach it. And that is another thing which I find very interesting from the Standish Group, and we call it emotional maturity. Because it are projects because of the fact that they can fail. So if you have a organization which says we are not allowed to make any errors, that is not emotional maturity, because you will make errors. That is part of the project. Only you have to repair fast. You have to be swift on that part. But especially again in governmental sense, you are not allowed to make errors. But I think that's very hard, because if you look at children, how do they learn to walk? By falling and standing up again. So I think that the learning curve should be much more respected, and that will lead to a better adoption. But it also means that you have emotional maturity in your organization. And well, that is what I like also about the research of the Standish Group. We once had a very nice workshop with a marriage counselor. The marriage counselor said the Gotham Institute is able to analyze a relationship within 5 minutes and see what the chances are that they are still a couple within the coming 3 years, with an accuracy of over 90%.
Wow.
So we are asking, but how is it possible? How is it possible that you can, because that is marvelous, of course, also for your team setting. If you want to have a good team, you want to know if they are going along for the next 3 years. And that marriage counselor said, well, it's all about appreciation. You can see it already when they are talking to each other. If they appreciate and respect each other, that is very much an indicator that the relationship will hold. So now, instead of looking at the number of full-time equivalents and all the resumes, I'm looking towards how are they connecting? Do they know each other's first name? Are they interested? If it becomes very tough in the project, are they going to help each other? Because that are the things that really turn out to be of great importance of a good team.
Right. That's so interesting, because when you think about what organizations and project teams tend to focus on when they invest in what they think are the things that will make them more likely to succeed, they're more likely to invest millions or tens of millions, maybe even hundreds of millions of dollars in software, in the technical implementation, in, as you mentioned, getting more FTEs on the project. But it sounds like what you're saying is what organizations need to focus more on is just training themselves and maturing their organizations and their emotional intelligence and all that stuff. It's not really about the technology, which we can all learn. You know, anyone can learn technology, but that's the harder piece. That's the secret sauce, is what you're describing, the more intangible piece of it.
I love the question, and because it is so crucial, because I'm lecturing for my students. So I'm saying you have to do this and you have to do that, and that increases your chances. But looking at current research, the good sponsor is the most important independent factor of success. And that means it could only be 1 or 2 persons.
Right.
And that scares me, because it means that the success of your project could depend on 1 or 2 people. And if you're looking at it, it's also very logical. because the good sponsor is the one who is articulating the vision of the organization, but actually is listening. It is not the project leader. It is the one who's listening and saying, "Hey, how are we doing this? And what is the organization in transformation doing?" And trying to bond. And the good sponsor is something which for me was so new that I said to my fellow researchers at the study group, I have never read a book about the good sponsor. I know about the good team leader and the project leader, but what is it? So they decided to write a book about the good sponsor. And the good sponsor is actually not very much present. So we had a workshop with the Harvard Medical School, and we asked them, how much time does a good sponsor have? Well, I was very surprised, 3-4 hours a month. So what can you do in 3-4 hours, and why would it be so important? Because they know the organizational roadblocks for the digital transformation. They know where to look out for, let's say, falling off the cliff. And they are connecting the relations, the people in organizations who are making that transition happen. So when I saw that, I think this is not about project leadership on the IT project. This is the business transformation actually, but then in the sense of the good sponsor. So, and also other researchers, for instance, the Danish professor Bent Flyberg, he did a beautiful research about how big things are done. And he also came to the conclusion that thinking slow, acting fast of Kahneman, which is about thinking slow, is understanding it as a leader, what has to happen. And then during implementation, go fast. That first phase, the good sponsor, is of the greatest importance. So for me, that are still takeaways. I said, okay, we have to be very modest because sometimes your success depends on picking the right sponsor.
Right. That's really interesting. And I want to thank Yakub on YouTube for that question, but also for the super chat contribution as well. So thank you for contributing to our cause here on the super chat. You've got some people that are intrigued by this point as much as I am, Professor. WW on YouTube says emotional maturity is an excellent point. So thank you for that comment, WW. I have a question here I want to get to here too from Alcinda on LinkedIn. Alcinda says, curious to know the geographical spread of these case studies and if there's a pattern in how ERP is implemented in different parts of the globe, or if the themes are generally similar across.
This is a very interesting question. And of course, most of the data we have from the Danish group, about 60% is US, is Canada. I think that we are about 25 about Europe, and then we have Asia, which is actually much, much bigger than in the data we have. So I try to read some of those position papers, try to read some case studies, and I see very much differences. And the differences are within Asia, for instance, very different to compare. Like, for instance, Australia and New Zealand, they are more like the Commonwealth countries. So the data about the projects, how they are done, but also their failures, they are used to learn. So we can see that in Australia, we can see that in New Zealand. But it doesn't mean that there are no failures, for instance, in other countries in Asia. But they are not that much, let's say, as a learning capability. So, making a small joke, there are no failed projects in North Korea, for instance. They're all successful projects because the mindset is that it should be done on one way only, and then you just adapt and you adjust. But I can see that also there are some failure rates in Japan, and they are very much comparable to what we see in the US. But I think it has to do with the learning curve, that you can really learn from things and you anticipate on that. So I like the question a lot. It's very difficult, by the way, to get all the data because not, as I mentioned, everybody is willing to share the data from their projects. And also there is a different, and this is very important for Alcinda as well, I think in where it is implemented. So most likely we are talking about, for instance, retail implementations. Well, they have better scores because you know the box is coming in, the box is coming out. If you're doing a policy making process for a government for a non-existing law which has to be implemented in 3 years' time, it's much harder. And so also here, and And if you're looking at a really global scale, I would say that size is very much important. And I
Mm,
would say small, smaller, smallest. If you have a capability of making a small introduction and then implement and scale up, your chances are much higher. Because small also means in time, duration, very small. So yeah, there is a regional effect, but I think that size still outruns the differences.
yeah. Yeah. I'm always fascinated by how different cultures in different parts of the world create different behavior and different risks and different opportunities. For example, the difference between an organization or a geographic culture that is very hierarchical and structured versus one that's more independent and decentralized and free thinking. You think about
Right,
those two scenarios and how does that
right.
affect an implementation and how does that affect the chances of success and things of that nature.
You're somewhat right. We had a research on a merger, and that's interesting, especially if there are two different countries involved. It was a merger between a French airline and a Dutch airline.
Hmm.
And the Dutch are very much salesmen, as you might guess. And they had the idea that an option on the cargo in the airplane was time based, which means that the last day the prices went up for delivery, for transport, because they were urgent things to be shipped by the plane. While in France, it was just the cubic, let's say, volume which was counted. Well, then, if you are going to do a merger of two systems and you're not aware of the difference in language and the difference in applying that time based approach to pricing, well, you get a lot of surprises. So, what you see there is that the ERP actually also is the DNA of the organization. It's almost Conway's Law, which is there in the system. And then you say, hey, this is the same field, the same attributes. Let's merge. Well,
Hmm.
that is, I think, where also culture comes in, because culture is a way of making agreements, and they are, of course, supported by the system.
Right. Yeah, that's very interesting. And here's a question I want to get to too. I know you mentioned before, Professor, that the internal maturity and skills and capabilities of an organization, particularly the executive sponsor, are the key reasons or the key determinant of success versus failure. But you also need to, maybe to a lesser degree, I do need those successful or those effective outside partners. So I wanted to ask a question along those lines here. This is from Johnson on YouTube. Johnson says, what attributes, signs, or behaviors make up a good implementation vendor to help a business transition to an ERP? So, in other words, have you done any research on the external factors or the external capabilities or variables from an implementation technical partner that might influence success versus failure?
Now, this is very interesting, because that is something which in my family was the case, as we were, of course, pioneers on the ERP. Also, my brother had an ERP company. And when we did implementation, we were the vendors, we were the partners. But actually, a project did cost us a lot of effort, attendance, but also time. The mindset should be of a partner that it is not the one part of implementation, it is the recurring revenues when you are using it the next 10 years. So a good partner takes into account that the project could be difficult, but that the best customer is the one who is using it for 10 years afterwards still. And I think that you can see in the way you are making your contracts. You can see that in the way you are arguing with your customer. My brother, for instance, I always thought that he made a quarrel with his prospects, with his customers. But what he actually was saying is, I take my responsibility for the system, you take your responsibility for your organization. And together we have to make it work. I cannot do it as just a vendor, as a partner, if you're not able to help your people changing the business processes. So we are making a good agreement here. I am doing my utmost to make a success, but it also holds for your organization. And that was, I think, key, because you can, of course, say, well, this is a beautiful system, just turnkey, this is your budget, and it will be there in a year time. No. Because it is about the people in the organization, you have to be tough on the relationship up front, because you need each other when it becomes difficult. And I think that is, for me, very interesting to see that some partners are not understood that well. For instance, if you have a new technology, your pricing could be half or even a third of your competitors.
Mm.
And what is the response then, for instance, for an organization? Cannot be true. You are too cheap. That cannot be quality. And
Right.
so there are some things you have to explain. And it is so difficult because if you're looking at a car, you can see, well, that is a kind of class car I want to buy with that pricing. But actually, when you're looking at software, it is very difficult as a customer to value what is under the hood. So that means that you really have to go to the discussion about what am I as a partner doing? I am investing in your organization for a successful project because I want to be a partner for the next 10 years. I'm not
Right.
here for just the implementation. I think that for me was one of the things which was helpful to see when relationships were built in the ERP implementations.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So, based on everything you've said so far and all these different variables that you've discussed and that you've done in your research, what percentage of implementations approximately would you say are qualified as successful versus failure? And I know you mentioned at the very beginning of this conversation that
Right,
you have to define what success versus failure means. But if you use
right,
your criteria,
right.
what would you how would you categorize the failure rate or the success rate?
Okay, so based on the data, we say the modern definition is on budget, on time, and the customer is satisfied. And then we make a distinction between the project-based approaches. So we have developing from scratch and build it yourself. We have developing by using components, and we have the purchased applications off the shelf. So, and then the off the shelf is the most successful. But mind you, that is 44% successful, which means on budget, on time, and delivering on
Mm,
satisfaction. So actually a valuable product as well because the customer can use it.
right.
And then there of course is a second category which we call challenged. And challenge means, well, I did expect more, for instance. I expected faster. I expected, well, and that is about 36% on the ERP. And then we have a category which is called failed. And that is a very hard one for me as an expert for the course. Because not using it is a failure. But
Hmm.
does it mean that it is only directed towards the technology again?
Mm,
Now, it could also say something about the good place of the customer.
right.
So, in that respect, we have about 44% success, 36% is challenged, and we have a 20% which is failed. But that is a average. And you
Mm,
know, as statistics, averages can be really interesting, but
right.
also be very misleading. So what I did do, Eric, because we had this conversation today, I had a look at the database and I make the distinction between the ERP implementations below $1 million and above $1 million. And that is interesting because then again, you can see if you have a project which is below 1 million, and I'm not counting the licenses, I'm not counting the equipment, I'm
Right.
counting labor cost, I'm counting man years because that is the most important factor again, people.
Right.
So if you are counting about $150,000 for a year at work, it means that a project which we call a small one is below $1 million. It's about 6-7 man years. Okay.
Okay.
So if you have done that, your chances of success is 70%.
70,
That's
70.
70%. Yes, 70%. And only challenged 18%. So it means that small again is beautiful.
Mm,
And that is hard because you know that ERP is actually the total systems approach of the 1960s. It is the enterprise resource planning software entirely. But if you can do the adoption on a based step-on-step approach, and you can get below that 6-7 man years of implementing, well, your chances are very good, very good. But
mm,
if you're doing the opposite, and I've seen those of course in the court cases, you start with a budget of $100 million, your chances are not that good. So I think that is also again the good leader, the
mm.
leadership about good sponsor. Know that you are emotional mature if you are not over ambitious. because that is not what people can handle. They cannot handle working on the system on Friday and then everybody on Monday is changing the world. That is too hard. And so again, here the data shows that you have to be very much more precise. And as one of the people of the IT, I like this because people saying it's all failure. That's not correct. That's not correct. There are beautiful things done, beautiful value. I would say if we turn out old computers now, we don't have any wealth anymore. So it is there to
Right.
stay. But I think that we should be much more careful about the implementation and the adoption because it is a human-centric approach.
Right. So, what about the adoption of emerging technologies like artificial intelligence and analytics, machine learning, predictive analytics, all kinds of different newer emerging technologies, Industry 4.0, Internet of Things. I've got a million buzzwords I can continue with, but I'll stop there. But what are the how are these newer technologies that are evolving in the ERP space? How is that affecting, or is that affecting the dynamics of implementation success versus failure?
It is. And of course, I'm very positive, but I also have to be very critical. So when we're looking at I think that again, it is about also what is the synergy between, let's say, the people and the AI.
Mm,
And because when I'm not really on the topic, I always try to figure out some way to get my research in place. So I define a master thesis project proposal. And then I always have students who say, I like to do that proposal.
right.
So now I'm looking at the AI trias politica, which means that one AI system is producing, and it has to be done. It goes very fast. It goes on a nanosecond basis, and the things are run beautiful. But there also has to be some control. So that is the second power of the trias politica. And that cannot be done by humans as well, because we are not always there 24 hours a day. We are not that fast. So we have two different educated language models which are connecting and trying to figure out if things are okay within some thresholds and looking at the biases, for instance. And then there is, of course, a difference of opinion between the two AI systems. And then the human role is there to make a decision, an informed decision about what are our guidelines. How do we see this approach for our customers, for instance? What is the, and I think that is something which will change the ERP world in different domains.
Mm,
It will be in the implementation. So we would have much more different business model in place, which can tailor made based for a certain value stream. I think that's possible. So that is on the implementation part, but also in the execution part, because ERP is very valuable for the execution part as well, and we have to monitor that. So I think on that respect, we can and we should use AI responsibly.
mm.
Responsibly means that we take into account the human responsibility of being accountable for what is being done in our organizations.
Right. Yeah, very, very good point. And I know you shared with me a paper that you co-authored about the whole AI governance and your kind of thoughts on how you've got to have some parameters or guardrails in place for AI. And I imagine that's true not just at a macro society level, but also organizationally. You've got to set those same sort of parameters that are important to you as a business.
Yeah.
Yeah, very interesting. Here's a question now. I'd be curious to get your opinion, Professor, and I'll share my opinion on this as well because I have fairly strong opinions on it. This is from WW on YouTube. WW says, quick question. Would you approach procuring an ERP technology before or after functional and process convergence to drive the requirements of the business?
Beautiful question. I'm very much a fan of Taleb, which talks about the black swan and also
Mm,
writes about the anti-fragile world. And as I just said, I cannot be sure of what was happening in the next 3, 4, or 5 years. And that means that you cannot be complete on starting with all the requirements. So you need the competence to be flexible and adjustable. So that part, I agree with this statement that you shouldn't do it all upfront as a grand architecture, knowing what is going to happen. But there are some things which you do need to know, and that is who you are and how you can do your current business. So, because otherwise you're going to make a deep dive without any safeguards.
Right.
But I like the question a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, one way to think about it too is not an either or proposition, but more of an iterative approach to where if you have, say, one common categorization of business processes is level 1 through level 5. And level 1 is sort of the macro end-to-end process. Level 5 is the detailed, what screen do I go to? What fields do I enter? How do I enter the fields in a certain system? Very detailed, granular workflows. So if you think of it as level 1 through level 5, you're not going to go do level 5 early on before you pick the technology, partially because things change, as you mentioned, Professor, but also because it depends on what technology you're deploying. That's going to influence your level 5. But you can define, and you should define level 1 to maybe even level 3 of your business processes, where independent of what technology you use, this is how you're going to run your business, and this is how you want it to look in the future. And then when you pick the technology, then you go build out the details of level 4 and level 5, and you reconcile any misalignments or things like that. So that's one thing we've seen work really well with our client base as well.
This is very interesting because what I also think is that we are not using the potential of what the system could offer. So
Hmm.
we are so happy when we have done the implementation and we are running the system. But mind you, there is so much more possible within the boundaries of the system that actually you should not stop. You
Right.
should go on continue. And then you see it is a end. It is a
Right.
long term, short term. It is a operational thing, but also a strategic thing. And what I find very a pity is that when we have done the implementation, we are not measuring the improvement in value. So we are again looking back towards what we have spent. What I would like to see is what we are going to earn with the system, what we're going to do. And the benefit tracking is almost not done in organizations. And if you have benefit tracking and you can see, hey, I can adjust it a little bit and I can do that, and that we can improve, then I think that the world will much more appreciate ERP as well, because now it's seen as a big, giant hurdle to get towards the new system, and then we are okay. No, then we're going to start. Then we're going to make really money with this system, and I think
Right.
that is something which is in the question as well. So you can do some things upfront. You have to do something upfront. But please keep your eye open. As I said before, it is not a static business case. It is dynamic. Things are
Right.
changing, so you can make use of that differences.
Yeah, and especially with the rate of change of technology today and the fact that most organizations are moving to cloud-based solutions that are constantly evolving, constantly improving, you have to almost view these projects as not a finite one-time event, but more of a continuous journey. I mean, if you don't do the continuous work, the continuous improvement, the learning, the pivoting, and all that stuff based on the technology you've deployed, you're really wasting a lot of time and value, I would think.
Yeah. I like it a lot because Simon Sinek said we have finite games and infinite games.
Right.
And if you compare that to your marriage or your partnership you have, would you say that you are the winner in that collaboration? You can't. Both
Right.
should be winners. So there is a conception that we all have projects, and indeed we do need projects. I agree with it. But that are finite state things. And we should look at the infinite part, which because the organization will grow, will flourish afterwards. So I think that the infinite, therefore we called it beyond infinity. Have a look at that. If you are value based on that approach, you can also see it is not the number of functionalities you have, but the usage. And then we can see again that you don't need all the functionality in the world, but you need the right combinations to make the value. And I think that is very interesting part as well. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Here's a question. We haven't really gotten too far into the concept of user adoption, but this is a question from a user on LinkedIn. I don't see the name of the person, but this is from LinkedIn. It says, how would you define the user adoption into the definition of success? And did you include that in your study? So in other words, you looked at satisfaction, you mentioned
Right,
satisfaction was one of the criteria.
right.
Was user adoption a separate line item, or was that included within satisfaction, or how did you factor that in?
Well, for let's say the database, we had about 122 attributes. This could be categorized, I think, in the direction of, let's say, the satisfaction part. But I think the question is very much more specific. And that is, of course, is in the eye of the beholder, what does the user do with the system? How is the adoption on that level? And I think that is not a quantitative question, but a qualitative question. So what we do see, and that I think very remarkable, is that some users are very creative. And what we call a bug, they call a feature. And so they are much more, and that is what we call the law of, let's say, the users. They could be your best friend, but they could also be your worst enemy in the projects we have seen. So if it's talking about the user adoption, I think it is not only meant about the quantity, like it is used or how many people are using it. It's also about the perception of the adoption. And I think that is a very important indicator for me. Are people really happy? Are they really helped by the system? Are they really thinking, well, wow, this is something which I'm proud of. I'm going to tell it to the other people. So user adoption in that sense, in my opinion, humble opinion, is also more qualitative. And should also have a look at the subjective perspective of how they encounter the system to be valuable for their customers, because they want to do the best thing they can, and also adjustable, so that they are also part of the continuous improvement. So I think it is a very good question, and I cannot answer it on a quantitative basis, but on the quality, I think it is a very early indicator of the value you're going to bring with your projects.
Interesting. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And then this is a question from Darian on YouTube. What does the future of this research look like? So in other words, I assume you'll continue this research. You'll add to the 120,000 or 100,000 plus case studies, but how do you see the research evolving and changing over time?
Well, actually, the statistical part, because we had a flat line, we are not very much doing very much more of the same things as well. But where we're looking now is trying to get a more focus group approach on the concept of flow. So I did an invitation on LinkedIn that people who are interested to brainstorm with us and to talk about with us. Because I think we are discovery. It is not just there in a very statistical basis. We did write a chapter for a academic book about the digital enterprise, and we found about 5,000 case studies which could be, let's say, representatives of the digital enterprise. So we see that we are now a little bit more to the qualitative side. So we will continue our research, but it will not be statistical. I think it will be much more focus groups. And we try to focus on defining the concept of flow, just to make it more clear that it is just as valuable as waterfall, as agile, but to focus on the current organization. So what we talked about ERP is there, so it is in the operation. That doesn't mean you are not changing anymore. So I think that part, we are now much more focusing on the flow-like modernization. And the reason why we are doing that for our research, and it is much more qualitative discovery, is because that rates are even much more impressive and could be a breakthrough to the flat lines we have seen in the last 25 years. So if we're looking at successful flow-like modernization, the average chances are 71% on success. And on challenged, 28% is challenged, but only 1 to 2% is failed, which is very logical again, because you're already using it. And so it is not a miracle, but it is something which is so interesting to see. Can we use that number of that low, let's say, failure rate to be adopted in a flow-like approach? Could we do refactoring when we are working with it? Could we isolate certain parts so that we can don't have to have that big bang boom? Because the big bang booms are the ones who are causing the project failures, especially. So one of the famous quotes of my fellow researcher in the US is, if you don't want any project failures, don't do it. Yeah? So don't do projects.
Right. That's brilliant. I never thought of that. All these years I've been searching for the answer of how to avoid failure, and it was that simple.
Right, right.
That's a great point, though. I mean, it is true that people have to recognize you are taking risk, and they're
Yeah.
on the flip side, there are things you can do to mitigate and minimize those risks. And I think organizational dynamics and organizational behaviors, they seem to repeat themselves over time, over years and decades. It seems like it's sort of the technology's changing, agile approaches change, all these different things change. But one thing that doesn't change are some of these mistakes that organizations make, including what you were talking about before about not focusing enough on themselves and like how can they better lead the transformation versus assuming that the right technology or the right technology partner is going to solve that for you. And hopefully organizations will learn that lesson here in the not too distant future, and your research will tell a different story maybe in coming years.
I hope so. I really hope so. I hope that one time I will be obsolete and that we have beautiful transitions from systems, because that means that we have achieved our goals. So I would really love to see a better response on that chances for your digital transformations, indeed.
Right. Absolutely. So just to maybe summarize all your decades in mass amounts of knowledge, if it's possible, I'd like to ask you a sort of a closing summary question here, which is based on your research and experience, what top 2 or 3 pieces of advice would you leave us all with? If you're going to remember 2 or 3 things from this conversation, what are those things that we should remember in our digital transformation?
Yeah. I think that knowing the people in your team, knowing your good place, and having a good sponsor, that is not only based on data, it's also based on your experience. And if it doesn't feel right, it isn't right.
Mm.
You better start again. So the kill switch up front within about 2-3 weeks is beautiful because you only lose 2-3 weeks. So what I would take away is really focus on your, let's say, experience you have with people. And when you say, well, we trust each other, we know that we have the capabilities, the skill set as mentioned, I think then we can look to beautiful times ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great closing advice. And how can people learn about you or connect with you? What's the best way to stay in touch with you here after this conversation?
I'm very much open for discussion, and I'm a very much frequent user of LinkedIn. So LinkedIn would be beautiful to connect. Then I can see also the other side. When I'm doing lectures, for instance, and for new students, executive masters, I'm always looking at my students on LinkedIn. So when I start my lecture, I will say, oh, this is interesting. About 1,000 years of experience is before me. So I have to be very humble. So
Right.
I would like to connect via LinkedIn. So I can also see a little bit about your background. And like this webinar is beautiful. People from the US, people from Africa, South Africa, Australia. I like really to see a little bit more because for me, I'm the one who learns the most. Like John Cleese said, the one who laughs the most learns the most. Now, for me, this is very interesting to do. So thank you very much, Eric, for this invitation.
Well, thank you for being here. Really appreciate it. I'm glad we could have you on the show. And I learned a lot from you as I did last time I spoke with you. And I suspect I'll learn a lot from you going forward too. So thank you for being here, Professor. And thank you to the audience for the great questions. Watch out for this interview in the complete episode of Transformation Ground Control. It'll be 2 weeks from tomorrow. Will be the episode that features Professor, as well as other content we'll add to it as well. So you can check out our podcast at transformationgroundcontrol.com. The show is sponsored by Third Stage Consulting, which is a company I work for and work with. Third Stage Consulting is a tech agnostic consulting firm that helps clients with digital transformation. So be sure to reach out or connect if you'd like to learn more about us. But otherwise, have a great rest of your week. Thank you again, Professor. Have a great week, a good rest of your day, and we will see you next time, same place. We do these live interviews every week, every Tuesday at the same time. So be sure to join us every week going forward. Hope you have a great week, and we'll see you soon. Take care.